Part 12. BookQuote reading from my ZenMind balcony. In this episode, I touch on the topic of living with PTSD on the autism spectrum, exposure anxiety, trauma, stigma, and autism, as well as Asperger syndrome and alcohol abuse. Exposure anxiety and the impact of war on personality. Some people cling to the environment, terrified of being eaten up, taken away again. Others feel they have been through so much they have little tolerance for indulgence in minor melodramas, taken so seriously or indulged in by those without exposure anxiety. Some are like war veterans, shell-shocked and traumatized in the face of any reminder of loss of control or imprisonment, including that of being needed or loved too much. Some are so weary of the struggles that, once free, instead of joining the world, they sit more peacefully in their own. Some are like starving beasts, suddenly set free, almost overloading the environment, as though each minute will be the last. Some watch and wait for the captor to sneak up on them, certain after years of reinforcement that it could never just leave. Living with an internal war, swinging between a state of war and truce, or recovering from years of having been in a state of war or alternation, all has an impact on personality. High functioning. First, let's consider the term high functioning. Lisa says, high functioning means I'm able to work extremely hard to hide who I really am, so that my autism is mildly experienced by other people. So I get comments like, you don't look autistic, you don't act autistic, you don't seem autistic. Or they say, I'm autistic too, because I've successfully mimicked NT behavior. What is meant by high functioning is how well an autistic person is able to change their behavior to mimic those around them, to fit in socially. It's not copying, that would be much easier. It's the autistic person using their own personality and mimicking the people around them. Social misunderstanding, labeling, and the impact on personality. Exposure anxiety can give the appearance of being aloof, indifferent, flippant, lacking empathy, selfish, contrary, disturbed, robotic, defiant, or spoiled. The impact of having a social judgment constantly reinforced becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I was judged disturbed, and I could sense people's fear. Social misunderstanding and social judgment can, on the one hand, convince the self it is everything the environment says it is, especially when all social emotional contact, insight and reflection is so governed by exposure anxiety. On the other hand, social misunderstanding and social judgments can trigger exposure anxiety to either hide within such claims as an excuse and way out of expression of self, or it can outright counter the expectations of the environment. Those who say he or she can't help it because of the autism and jump in to take over at every turn may well be giving exposure anxiety the perfect excuse to laugh at the environment for providing the excuse which has the self give up fighting for expression.
So to me, if we're actually looking at diagnostic criteria, in some ways I think the first thing we might want to look for is different ways of perceiving the world in terms of senses. I do diagnose, that's what I do. Back in the 70s when I qualified, bearing in mind it was hippie era and so on, I refused to diagnose. I said that everyone should be treated as an individual and their needs should be met and we shouldn't label anybody. And there was this group of people that, because I was refusing to diagnose, and I deeply apologised to people in the room for doing this, who weren't getting their needs met. And so I turned full circle and said the only way these people are going to get their needs met is if I diagnose. So I won't accept this child at this school unless you've got a bit of paper. So I'll give people a bit of paper, and I don't like it.
Social communication disorder became a new category in the DSM-5 that roughly corresponds with this. It covers cases involving difficulty with the pragmatic social flow of language in the absence of the restricted and/or repetitive patterns of behavior. The DSM-5 acknowledges that individuals with social communication disorder often experience social deficits as a result of their differences in communicative style, although not presumably to the extent of those with more pervasive forms of autism. Individuals diagnosed with social communication disorder probably experience much the same stigma as those with other forms of autisticity, and research indicates this condition may not be all that distinct from autism. When a person is born with these different abilities and unconventional social orientations, even though different frameworks of understanding can modify the negative way they may come to see themselves because of their differences, it is changing the environment of judgment and stigma they live with that can make the biggest therapeutic differences in their life. The elimination of Asperger's was the most controversial change made in the DSM-5. It makes one wonder about the ephemeral nature of diagnosis and what might become of autism in the future. It is subject to ongoing revision, even though the lived experience of the word it involves is deeply rooted in the structure of a person's felt agency. One of the main criteria in the DSM, common to many conditions, is that there must be significant impairment in day-to-day life to necessitate diagnosis. One autistic online forum participant expressed confusion about this. He commented, "It's almost as if you can go in and out of the diagnosis based upon your ability to cope at a particular moment in time. As specific neural correlates underlying autism are discovered, will it be considered a strictly medical disorder or series of disorder rather than a mental health issue? Will autism only remain as a catch-all for all those conditions whose neurological correlates have not yet been discovered? The person who falls short may everywhere find himself inadvertently trapped into making implicit identity claims which he cannot fulfill. Compromised in every encounter which he enters, he truly wears the leper spell. It is an autistic catch-22. The more invisible high-functioning autism is, the more intensely stigma is experienced because socio-conventional expectations are not diminished by the appearance of symptoms and disability. This is the opposite of stigma associated with conditions, for example, like epilepsy, where more intense and frequent seizures result in greater stigma. They described their condition as part of myself I have to work with and around. At the same time, participants diagnosed as adults expressed feeling relief when they were diagnosed. The participants confirmed previous research in this area by reporting that their diagnosis provided a validating framework that brought healing and positive change. Self-confidence grew, relationships became easier, and others became more empathetic and patient, all because of the validating discourse provided by diagnosis. Yet, paradoxically, diagnosis represents a paradigm that characterizes autism as an inherent disability, a position the participants did not endorse. Murray points out that the idea of autism as a problem or deficit is in fact built in during diagnostic evaluation. In other words, when medical diagnosis provides the main validating framework for autistic personhood, it imposes at the same time a pathologizing model that implies high-functioning autism are diminished, impaired, afflicted, and disabled. In accepting diagnosis as the resolution to a search for validation, high-functioning autism paradoxically undermine their autistic integrity. This is only logical, since to be situated in a discourse of pathology is to be delegitimized. For high-functioning autism, accepting a diagnosis means accepting a socially constructed mental of disability, even if they prefer to see themselves as simply different and oriented towards the world through their unconventional social orientation and style of communication. High-functioning autism is one variation of living with autisticity that represents more than the troublesome experience of certain challenges. It is a fundamental aspect of our personhood. We may go in and out of diagnosis depending on current criteria and how they are interpreted, but autisticity is intertwined inseparably with us and part of who we are. Whether socially dominant institutions such as medicine validate high-functioning autism with a diagnosis due to relative severity or other criteria is not as important as the way these qualities affect the way we live, interact with each other, and modulate the way we find adventure and thrive according to our own potential. Contradiction of diagnosis. This leads us to the highest conceptual leap of theorization based on the outcome of the research. It was rooted in a silent contradiction contained in participant reports and points to the deconstruction of diagnosis as a dominant validating framework of autistic difference. Here I use Derrida's term deconstruction to refer to a process of challenging established concepts, practices, and power structures, not just to be critical and destructive, but to make room for productive new possibilities. Participants acknowledged a socially disabling aspect to their condition, but also maintained they did not feel inherently impaired.
Also look at other things. Sadly, as Luke said, there should be no reason, but there is an increased prevalence of anxiety, depression, I think eating disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. We had a discussion recently at our post-diagnostic support group about post-traumatic stress disorder.
So if they're not deemed traumatic by the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, you don't get the diagnosis of PTSD, and therefore you don't get any intervention. So a large number of those people, 40%, had experienced what sounded like probable PTSD within the last month, and 60% reported trauma at some point in their lives. And this was not what's called a clinic population. So quite often research is done on what are called clinic populations. So those are people that are in touch with mental health services by and large. So this was a group of people that were not in touch with those people. So if you don't get the diagnosis, if people don't perceive those life events as traumatic because they're not in the current diagnostic criteria, you're not going to get help. So being autistic, in my opinion, and according to this research group, increases the chances that of complex post-traumatic stress disorder.
Talking about DSM-5, someone saying, unfortunately, emotional flashbacks are not in DSM-5.
Very helpful. Well, as you know, my thoughts on these criteria are if we got them right, then we wouldn't have to keep revising them. And it's right, okay. So, sorry about that. It's the American Psychiatric Association.
Somebody asking, did anyone have memory issues blocking out the memories in relation to the CPTSD? I didn't remember mine until I had my daughter, which triggered the memories.
I do know of people where they had blocked something out and then something did trigger it and then they could not stop the thing they had blocked out, which probably was quite an effective strategy, but then, yes, giving birth, I suppose, there's going to be such a massive hormonal change, let alone anything else. But yeah, I have heard of that before, where memories become unblocked and then become incredibly intrusive.
Dr. Robert Skeer, Trauma and Healing, quote, "Around the time I met Peter Levine, who is a psychologist who started a technique called somatic experiencing for trauma. He happened to live in Lyon, close to me, and asked to consult in my pain program. I had him come and do a demo with a couple of my therapists who had minor chronic pain problems, and both of them got over their pain. Trauma is stored both in the brain as well as in the body itself. It's stored in memory, and there are a lot of ways to define trauma or to define what it is and what it does. And one of them is a corruption of memory, and that is that memories are stored. And that doesn't just mean things you can imagine and bring up to consciousness, but also, and most importantly perhaps, all of the sensory experiences surrounding that event, pain, stimulation of the vestibular system, like in a whiplash, where your head goes back and forth. The chemicals that go on in the body have to do with the various neurotransmitters that trigger arousal and also trigger dissociation, which is what we perceive when we're in the freeze response as part of the fight, flight, freeze. And the fight-flight-freeze response, of course, is critical in understanding trauma because it is a state that is replicated in many ways in all of the symptoms of trauma later on. When one has this type of memory stored, and when one has frozen to do so, one has entered a state of dissociation, the numbing out or avoidance part of the symptom complex defined in the DSM-4. But avoidance and numbing is recurrence of the freeze. It's endorphinergic. You're numb. It's all associated with very profound parasympathetic tone rather than sympathetic-like in the fight-flight response. So that your heart slows, you're weak, you collapse. It's a state that when those memories emerge, one is propelled back into the freeze response or dissociative state. Touch, body movement patterns, any sensory input at the time of the trauma. If a freeze occurs, you store it in what is called procedural memory. Procedural memory is unconscious, implicit, non-declarative as opposed to declarative or explicit memory like trying to study or memorize a body of facts. It is totally unconscious. In fact, the somatic part is only experienced if it occurs with the somatic sensations being replicated that accompanied that trauma, whether it's pain or dizziness or stretching of a limb. Freezing is a common survival mechanism that all animals go through as well. Why does it affect humans so differently? Well, I show a video of the polar bear who's been shot with a dart, an anesthetic dart to tag the polar bear's wanderings, and after he comes out of his coma, which was really a freeze response because before he collapses from the dart, he was going into helplessness. So he froze. And what he did was, he went through what looked like a grand mal seizure, shaking all over, which is slow motion, however. It was clear that he was running. The freeze response was the completion of the failed act of escape, of flight, and that process erases in procedural memory all of the perceived events of that traumatic experience. It has a purpose to clear the decks, because then one doesn't have to defend oneself again from that thing that's in the past that you survived. So, just to be clear there, this animal has a natural, healthy way of discharging that freeze response. It erases the trauma at that point. It ceases to be a frozen trauma after it's discharged. What it does is, of course, extinguishes that event from memory because trauma is fear conditioning. You're conditioned to associate all these cues with the trauma, and they will elicit the symptom. And that's just plain old classical conditioning. So, this is a process of extinction, and all of the unconscious and conscious memories are extinguished. Wild animals, therefore, don't develop PTSD because they know how to discharge trauma. As we grow, we learn things that contribute to our sense of safety and survival. Unfortunately, many also learn about things that detract from those senses. Experiencing or witnessing assaults on the body like rape, molestation, vehicular accidents, mass violence, kidnap, and critical illness, among others, can leave a person feeling betrayed by expectations of safety, nurturing, and self-determination. People can also find themselves in natural disasters like floods, tornadoes, landslides, and blizzards, whereby they perceive great danger with no chance to control their living or dying. Whatever the reason, the short version of human response is that the amygdala and its accompanying structures engage to tell all the other parts what needs to happen: survival. Hormones are released, and the heart beats faster, pumping blood away from the extremities and towards organs and big muscles. Things tense up, and the body braces to either fight or run. We might also freeze, like a deer caught in a car's headlights. We feel paralyzed. Some people also report dissociating, or mentally going away from the situation, only to reassociate with no memory of the time being away. In some people, when the trauma is too much, they split into different personalities. Donna Williams was also diagnosed not only with autism, PTSD, but also with dissociative identity disorder.
Hello. I was going to talk a bit about dissociative identity disorder and about the idea that people have consciously created their alters, and so there's an assumption that that all people with DID will have somehow been highly imaginative and consciously created their alters. In my case, my alters go back to at least 2 years old, and as the core self, there appears to be signs in my photos that I was certainly mostly dissociated by 2 to 4 years old, and I stopped being able to really run the body or present in the body from after 4 years old. I wanted to say something about DID and the core self. When you have other parts that can communicate more easily than the core part can, those parts go forward in life to have more connection with people and more abilities and work, and the parts that struggle more with communicating stay more alone, and then the other parts feel they are more valid as the self than the one that has the difficulty communicating. And people were laughing and making fun of how hard it was, and this part of me gave up, and the other part went forward to get better at making senses. So I became the part that could type and use gesture, and when I met people who didn't speak English, I could be with them without speech. And I thought that when I'm older, I won't need to use speech. And I would always disappear when people were near me more than any of the others. So if I heard people speaking, I dissociated. And if people came close to maybe 1 meter from me, I was disappeared. So I didn't relate to the life of the others, even though it came from my dissociation. And when the others realized that the original one was the one with the most difficulty speaking, it was hard for them to accept I was an equal person, and I gave up to be more. I wanted just to be a ghost and very deep inside not have a lived life. And I always felt that to hear my voice was so ugly. I felt disgust of my voice, and I then didn't think that it was a stutter, because I had not often had a typical stutter, but when I tried to start using the speech I have, I realized that it is just a stammer, and that I am more ashamed of my voice and speaking all the more because others can speak so well more than me. But I learned that some people with this can speak more fluently when they use singing or accents or readings like with stored speech and like logic without connected to feelings. And I then looked at the different selves and knew that because of the abuse and violence that parts of me had tried how they could with whispering, singing, with script, with accents, with to convince themselves they were not Donna, and so escaped my difficulty. But I am the core of them, and without trying to face that my speech isn't ugly, and then I will speak as well as them and not be the one who is just the typing of their lives. And though I have been the observer and historian for my system, so what that means is that I'm aware of when the others knew about each other and whether or not they had any processes of creating each other. And certainly I have no memory of having created any of them. Pretty much I kind of went to sleep or was staring into space and lost connection with the body and didn't develop connection with the voice, and I stopped having conscious awareness of personal thought or any of that. So it's, if I have been a creator of my alters, then I've done it in a pre-conscious or unconscious state. However, there was certainly one of the alters who was aware of at least two of the others, and that was Polly. So when Polly was 2, she was under the bed, and at night to protect from what had been quite ritualized abuse, and terrified under the bed, she had sensed a ghost in the room that she felt was Willie, as she called Willie in years to come. And she was so frightened of this ghost, but so frightened of abuse, that she let this ghost become part of her, and so she felt she'd left the body. So basically she was aware of the experience of an alter being outside of her, and of having split. And that's not the same as some child who is indulging the creativity and imagination of a special private little world under a bed. If you're hiding from abusers who come in and choke you and suffocate you in the night, it's not really a fabulous celebration of the skills of imagination, and I find it really incredibly insulting that people project onto those situations that the person experiencing it has made their alters up. When this part of me was first back presenting in the body, it was, I guess, hard to have the others not trusting me, coming at me, testing me, discussing me, and then progressively into a phase where they were trusting me and letting me help them to resolve their stuff. Conflicts, trauma, issues, stuff that trust issues, and then progressively I moved to be able to experience not just co-consciousness, which is where I, as the core self, was still was present and able to experience them, but what I call co-presence, which is not the same as switching. It's sort of like you're still in the body, but then they're also in the body. It's almost like as if they're just to the side of you, and then sometimes you're just pushed out. It's like having two people present in the body alongside each other. And that was really strange, but the first time it was really jolting and jarring, like especially when they're experiencing extreme emotion like PTSD and you're actually still co-present in the body, and they're there too, and your energy is just smashing and repelling and smashing and repelling. But it got to a point where each had gone through that, and I was still standing. And then they were able to start to share.
Different people handle different dangers in different ways, according to the degree of coping assets they have available at the time. All three responses, fight, flight, and freeze, have anthropological uses. Cognitively, though, we don't get to choose. If the fear is great enough, lasts for a long time, or is frequent, coping mechanisms may not be enough. The brain and body learn different and often maladaptive ways of functioning, with the goal of dealing with danger. Re-experiencing. In real life, the re-experiencing aspects of PTSD include flashbacks and nightmares. Both phenomena are generally unanticipated and debilitating. Nightmares, for example, can seem so real, and the reactions during the dream can be just as intense. Some people wake up to find themselves hiding in a closet, drenched in sweat, crying or clawing or running down the street. Some wake up unable to move, paralyzed. Many avoid sleeping, especially at night. Flashbacks are similar. Anything can bring them on. though nobody's totally aware of exactly everything that's going on in a situation. The unconscious aspects of the mind often register things as a matter of course, and they might come out later. Thus, the buzzing of a bee could bring back the experience a little girl had in the backfield. The smell of gasoline takes a man right back to the deadly crash. How can you erase traumatic memories? Most of all, you must do this in an environment where you feel safe. When your amygdala doesn't get triggered, when you can get into a state where your amygdala is inhibited, then if those traumatic memories float up, they will not trigger the amygdala and then they get erased. So you discharge that trauma. But it needs to be done with the right technique and also a therapist who is trained in this way. Psychiatry must stop ignoring trauma. The single most important issue for traumatized people is to find a sense of safety in their own bodies. Bessel van der Kolk. Experience the world through our bodies just as much as our minds. We are continually transmitting cues to each other's nervous system, and we are continuously assessing our environment, our world, our safety. Dr. Porges suggests that we are like human polygraph machines. We evaluate the social environment and make the necessary behavioral adjustments. Often we can relax and settle in to the occasion as we have learned how. The difference with autistics is that their polygraphs are switched on high most of the time. They are generally in a constant scanning mode, checking for safety, but have not learned to read the environment well. Autistics have not learned to read social cues appropriately and have not learned to give out social cues. They do not easily smile or make appropriate facial gestures to calm people down. I'm not sure what to think of that, because I think it's the other way around. We autistics come from the sensory, the right hemisphere, and it is the left brain dominance from neurotypicals that actually makes it difficult to connect. When there are neurotypicals that manage to switch out of their left hemisphere dominance back into a balanced brain state, also sensing, so we meet in the middle, then connection is possible, and it depends on the person. Thus, given the little that we really know about the brain and how it interacts with an individual's social ecology, there are many things a professional should consider in the diagnostic process of an ASD person. For example, one needs to consider neurological or mental health difficulties such as language delays, intellectual disabilities, coordination disorders, ADHD, or other disorders associated with anxiety, attachment, conduct, regression syndromes, abuse in the home or sensory. Autistic individuals are vulnerable to being involved in abuse relationships without recognizing the abuse or knowing how to escape it. This leaves autistic individuals susceptible to chronic relational trauma, which over time can develop into PTSD. The autistic adult who does reach out for help and interacts with first responders, doctors, and victim advocates may find themselves traumatized due to the lack of understanding and communication difficulties between themselves and the people helping them, which is also a reason why many autistic adults do not reach out for help. For many autistic students, their behaviors are corrected and or modified to try and fit into the school society they are part of, instead of the school searching for an out-of-the-box solution that could take much less time and trauma. All behavior is communication. For the autistic student who needed muscle time but couldn't communicate that, the costs of the original interventions were confusion, being misunderstood, enduring operant conditioning, as well as for a long time not getting the sensory stimulation she needed to be successful in her classroom. In short, it seems that the mainstream wants autistic people with PTSD to fit into their idea of normal, instead of the mainstream meeting them at least in the middle. Thus, with many autistic client interventions, the behavior targets are typically designed to fit into the mainstream. That is, to make the mainstream comfortable with the problem person, regardless of what the intervention costs the client in losing their sense of self. Hence, it may not be what the client needs, but rather what tends to help mainstream people feel comfortable with the person who has the diagnosis, instead of helping the client to work with who they really are. This problem is difficult enough when there is one serious mental health diagnosis. Having two co-occurring diagnoses creates a more complicated, more confusing, less supported, and higher risk situation. What can cause PTSD for an autistic person? Social relationships. Relationships of varying kinds are fraught with potentially traumatic situations for autistic adults. Due to the trouble with socio-emotional reciprocity and difficulty interpreting non-verbal behaviors, communication, and any resultant bonding is challenging. Autistic people seek routine and they focus on the details of a situation. They might have intense or specific interests and be unable to see the point of small talk, or they're direct and honest, often without value judgments as non-autistic people understand them. Thus, an autistic person might appear to a non-autistic person as discourteous, impolite, or just weird. My PTSD symptoms can be triggered without warning, and I'm just learning what are danger perceptions and what is real. This gets complicated by the ASD rigidness wherein I need things to be predictable and consistent. The ASD makes it challenging for me to imagine others' mindsets. I read people according to what they present in the moment, rather than what they might be going through internally. I see what I see, and I make judgments about my safety in the moment. Lisa continues, I know that ASD PTSD also smash together in situations where professionals are trying to help me. One way that I have noticed is that of negative interpretations. In PTSD, my brain tries to keep me safe by finding possible danger. Because I've been hurt in many different ways, my brain can find danger in the smallest of ways. Slight body movements, a facial muscle move, an awkwardly asked question, being left out of, acknowledgement in a crowd, yelling even if it isn't towards me. TV shows, billing statements crossing in the mail, or someone being short in their responses, just to name a few. Do you know what happens when post-traumatic stress disorder PTSD and autism spectrum disorder ASD meet in the same unfortunate person? I do. A symbiotic relationship forms, and the symptomology of PTSD is enhanced by certain inherent characteristics of autism, creating a life marred by the struggles of a dual diagnosis that works with and against the other. Let me explain what I mean. PTSD flashbacks are triggered and experienced over and over again by a couple of defining characteristics of autism: perseveration and rumination. PTSD nightmares are made more lucid by an autistic brain that thinks in pictures. Co-occurring autism spectrum disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder, what do we know? As with all sciences, psychology is imperfect. That's what makes it so exciting. There are always new ideas and subsequent discoveries. Mental health and knowledge of the mind is ever evolving. Thanks to open-minded researchers and practitioners, people willing to open themselves up to skepticism and wonder, we now know that skull shape doesn't mean psychosis, and that the uterus doesn't float around the body. Each time a theory is disproved, more questions follow, leading in different directions. An idea occurs, it develops as the evidence takes it, and the idea turns into theory with more evidence, both scientific and practical. As it evolves into best practice, this is, of course, how we know what we know. To date, it's important, however, not to forget where these ideas come from and how they evolved into what we know today, and how they inform the future. Thus, let's look individually at autism and PTSD in terms of where we've been. Processing speed time is essential with an autistic person because of varying processing times, anxiety, alexithymia, and the other characteristics of autism. An autistic patient who also has PTSD may not only experience higher levels of anxiety, but is also at risk for experiencing a flashback if they are misunderstood or feel like the clinician is in any way hostile. An autistic client needs more time to appropriate, comprehend, and then communicate what's happening inside. This is usually frowned upon in many parts of society. Of course, in medical appointments, banking, ordering from a menu or everyday regular conversation, and the individual might not know how to ask for what they need.
Catatonia, where quite often people's bodies literally shut down, their motor movements deteriorate, and can look a bit like Parkinson's.
I did a video specifically on Catatonia Shutdown and Breakdown in Autism on my other channel, Pearls of Psychology, and this quote actually explains it quite well. Catatonia as shutdown, autistic children and adults can show a temporary shutdown of social interaction and communication at times of acute severe stress and anxiety, such as exams. In these cases, the individual gets back to normal as soon as the stressful event has passed. Many autistic individuals experience prolonged periods of shutdown. Forced or coercive exposure to distressing sensory experiences does not desensitize, it traumatizes.
I grew up, and Bob relates to this, I grew up with really mad behavior, and not just mine. I mean, people in my environment were crazier than me. Just surviving insane behavior, surviving torture, as in living with a psychopath who's a substance abuser and crazy, and bullying at school, and the segregation, that treating like, that's Donna, she's disturbed, that's Donna, she's psychotic, like go through the motions with her, but everyone else is a real child. And that stuff, it hurts your soul, it breaks your heart. It's the modeling of non-autistic life, and the fact that there were non-autistic people who had easy freedom, and who had so much freedom that they didn't appreciate it because they hadn't had to really fight for it. And I guess that made me want to have the same degree of equality and inclusion and level of experiences and sense of individuality and personhood, to not drown in your condition. It's one thing to celebrate the parts of your condition that are well worth celebrating, but not everybody has an autism fruit salad that's all perfect and magical and genius and fantastic. There's no, even though exposure anxiety says, I can't do this, I've got to become a cat. You say, well, I'm going to find a way to do this because I want to do this as fully as myself, or not at all. But you do, if you're living with that chronic fight-flight, you've got to first observe it and understand it. 2, you've got to build the dictionary of how you're going to outwit it. 3rd, you've got to take charge of being the parent of it and teach it that you are actually the boss and it's actually an out-of-control mechanism. And number 4, you say, this is the deal. I'm the person, you're the condition, and we're going to live on my terms, and if you're freaking out, we'll negotiate. I love it.
The autistic brain. While consistent under the umbrella areas of difficulty with social skills, communication, and unusually narrow areas of interest, is as cognitively and behaviorally diverse as any other human brain type. Some people on the spectrum are considerably less verbal than others. Some can claim success in the working world, whereas others struggle in a work environment. Some can mask it in social settings for longer periods of time than others, or not at all. Some learn to trust, whereas others don't. Still others have varying degrees of that trust in certain circumstances on certain subjects, always with the chance of having it come crashing down on them. All of these things can be going on at once, and helpers might never know the difference.
The principle that I call don't go to bed angry. So the principle of don't go to bed angry, to do with horse training, has to do with the fact that if your horse gets uptight during the training, starts to get uptight during the training, that you empty that uptightness back out. You get rid of that tension, you get rid of that worry, and you get your horse back to relaxed before you go further ahead. Now, the human version of don't go to bed angry, I'm sure if you're married, at your wedding you had an older, wiser family friend offer you some advice. They go, now, let me tell you, Sonny, there's one thing you need to know about being married. Don't go to bed angry. Okay, and what that really means is if there is any tension build up between the two of you during the day, sit down, talk about it, discuss it, get it out in the open, and get rid of it. Put it to bed. Get rid of that tension there. And then you go to bed, you wake up the next morning, everybody's happy. We're not bringing yesterday's arguments into today's arguments because we've resolved them. I mean, and that's another bit of marital advice people get given too, is don't bring up, when you're having an argument, don't bring up old arguments. But it's very easy to bring up old arguments if you didn't put them to bed in the first place. So I'll give you a good example with horses before I get going here. Recently I was in England doing some clinics, and a girl said to me, my horse is stupid. And I said, really, why? And she said, well, the other day I went for a ride. They call it hacking out. She was trail riding. I was hacking out, and a rabbit ran out of the grass, and it didn't really bother him. He kind of just looked at it, but it didn't really bother him. And then he went along a bit further, and another rabbit ran out of the grass, and he looked at it and didn't really bother him. And then a bit further, another rabbit went out of the grass, and it didn't really bother him. And we'd been riding for an hour or so, and there must have been 12 different rabbits came out of the bushes, and he kind of just looked at them, but it didn't really do anything silly. And then the 13th rabbit ran out of the bushes, and when it did, he went, ah, and he freaked out, spun around, and ran home and bucked me off. Like he'd seen 12 rabbits that day. What was the problem? He must be just stupid. And I go, no, he's not stupid. What would have happened was the first rabbit scared him a little bit, and he held on to that bit of worry. Okay, and then you went along a bit further, and another rabbit scared him a little bit, and he held on to that worry. He didn't let it back down. And then the third rabbit, and the fourth rabbit. And this horse's capacity must be 12 rabbits of worry. And once you get over that, that horse overflowed, and off he went. There's a trainer from Arizona named Harry Whitney, and he talks about your horse's worry cup. He says your horse can handle a cup full of worry. Your worry cup is this big. And he says your job is to have your horse's worry cup as empty as possible. Okay? So when he says your horse can handle a cup full of worry, he means your horse can contain a cup full of worry. He can hold it in. But once your horse's worry cup overflows and there's more worry than he can hold in, that's when you get a buck, a rare, a bolt, a spook, or whatever. And your job is to keep your horse's worry cup as empty as possible. I guarantee you this horse's worry cup is this big, and it went along and it saw one rabbit, and then it was here. It saw two rabbits, and it was here, and it saw three rabbits, and it was here, and 4, and 5, and 6, and 7, 8, 9, 10, finally got to 12 rabbits, and that horse can control itself. But one more rabbit's going to send it over the edge, and that one more rabbit jumped out, and the horse spooked, ran off, and now the girl thinks her horse is an idiot. So how do you go about getting rid of all your rabbits in the training of horses? Well, the big thing is, for me, it all starts with the groundwork. When I'm doing the groundwork, you're doing either one of two things. You're either desensitizing your horse or you're sensitizing your horse. You're teaching your horse things they need to respond to, and you're teaching them things they need to not respond to. And how you go about that is the same way we deal with anxiety in humans.
Autistics also have this limit of 12 rabbits. And when the worry cup is full, it is full, and then it is meltdown time. And therefore, it is the same goal to keep the worry cup always half empty if possible, and calm down again in between. Therefore, it makes sense that camouflaging and holding it in the long term is really harmful, because the stress level will rise. So it is better to get out of the situation that is stressful and calm down again. Autistic adults have to overcome invisible yet formidable obstacles in life to reach those milestones. There are so many struggles to persevere through, stigmas to ignore, and coping skills to use. On a minute-by-minute, hour-by-hour, or day-to-day basis. Lisa states, "What I look like on the outside is nowhere near accurate about what's going on inside, and once the external achievement is completed, the internal experience doesn't stop. For these people, the criteria for high functioning is arbitrary and off the mark. With ASD, things are not easy, no matter how it looks." While socializing in the mainstream world, the number of unknowns can seem boundless. Thus, when trying to be in a busy, neurotypical environment, autistic people can appear to need more than a mainstream person might, simply because the busy, non-autistic person switches gears quickly, and so, too, the autistic person speaks in an unexpected manner. Irritation, unfortunately, is put onto the neurodivergent person, rather than seeing that the two people have different ways of saying the same thing. The autistic person will turn things over and over again in their mind, looking for what happened. Closure of a relationship or social situation doesn't just happen for an autistic person. They need definite information. Otherwise, thoughts and concerns keep floating around, bumping into other situations, eventually becoming mixed up and overwhelming. The mother went away from the clinician's office feeling very misunderstood, confused, frustrated, intimidated, defeated, and triggered. The clinician didn't understand her autism, even though he was aware of it. She was triggered and struggled for the rest of the day while fighting off bad thoughts to figure out where it all went wrong in the clinician's room, and thinking about how she could possibly protect herself at next week's appointment, which she categorically wanted to avoid. Safety is paramount. I cling to past lessons because that's what I know, and because I believe that they will keep me safe. I don't know which cognitive experiences are true and which are due to PTSD. Another way in which PTSD and ASD tend to smash together is in other people's preconceived notions about my brain. In surface communication with people who are not regularly a part of my life, I tend to not disclose myself as autistic. It's too complicated. I try to mask and move through the various experiences. I can still get hurt and oftentimes very confused, but I keep it to myself and try to process it on my own. There have been times when I have had to reveal myself, however. Sometimes, such as with a doctor or with school system officials, I cannot get myself understood, and so I have to explain that I'm autistic and my mind interprets things differently from the mainstream. I share my diagnosis in the hope that they will open to working with my neurology as well as theirs. Sometimes that works out well, other times it does not. What I'm asking for here is presumed competence. I'm different in some ways from mainstream people, but I'm not an anomaly and I'm certainly not stupid. I've had to explain myself to therapists, prescribers, group leaders, even with long-term relationships, people I'd think might know better, but not everyone does. I've had people begin speaking in high volume as if I'm deaf. I've had people try to explain away their ill-informed behavior. I have people explain other people to me. What I often don't have is people trying to understand me and my neurology. I feel continually undermined and discredited, and while I love to cut people like that some slack, I can't always do that because the situation often doesn't make any sense. The strategy is to wear a mask, to hide the real self, to pretend to be normal, and to become the person other people would like you to be. It means becoming an expert mimic, faking it till you make it, and creating a script for social situations based on observations of similar situations. This may lead to social acceptance, but the psychological and energy costs are excessive. There can be intense performance anxiety prior to and during social interactions, and intense emotional and intellectual exhaustion afterward. There may be a great reluctance to reveal the true self, as there is a belief that person is defective and would be rejected, imitation, and the creation of a range of personas to achieve social integration and acceptance. And many autistics, unfortunately, have social anxiety. Me too. I take it as evidence that I don't belong. Also, the more people get to know me, the less high-functioning I appear to be, and the more our relationship breaks down, so there are two messages here. One, I'm accepted and can fit in as long as I work really, really hard to not be me. And two, if I do let someone into my life and start forming a friendship, the closer we get, the more they see the real me, and the less they like me until the relationship breaks down. The ultimate message is, I disappointed them. I'm not wanted. I'm not enough. It's not okay to be me. This is from the book Trauma, Stigma and Autism. Quote, stigma is a form of trauma. It targets people on the basis of beliefs about them that have nothing to do with who they are. It undermines a person's humanity and overshadows the fullness of their identity by placing assumptions about negatively perceived qualities over openness to their actual personhood. Although trauma is often framed in terms of a terrorizing event, it is the perceived physical and/or psychological threat to our personhood and residual self-protection that underlies much of the suffering involved. Having our humanity threatened, undermined, and devalued is fundamentally traumatic. It can shift us into a hyper-aroused state of defensive safety-seeking or guarded withdrawal and self-isolation. This kind of trauma is experienced as shame. Theologian, philosopher, and counselor John Bradshaw explored shame thoroughly. He distinguished innate shame related to healthy humility and toxic shame acquired through experiences of abandonment, rejection, blame, and abuse that oppress us into believing our fundamental humanity or true self is defective and flawed. Chronic invalidation can lead to an oversensitive danger alarm in the body-mind, waiting to be activated by the smallest trigger. We have much to learn from autism in this regard, because the humanly erosive process of chronic invalidation is constantly at work through stigma and stigmatization, micro-events that can make us feel like crawling under a rock, or even aliens on this planet. A better understanding of stigma and autism not only provides a unique perspective on the widespread problem of invalidated humanity, but also gives us helpful traction to work with this poignant difficulty. Loosening the grip of shame is possible one step at a time by managing the defensive reactions associated with invalidation trauma. Finding ways to counter everyday stigmatization processes and reimagine stigmatizing beliefs and assumptions helps create an environment of validating acceptance that nourishes shame resilience. Stigma can be based on visibly apparent things such as skin color, gender, and overt behaviors. It can also come from concealable things like certain forms of physical and mental health, diagnostic labels, sexual preference, socio-economic status, and religion. Sometimes the most challenging forms of invalidation come from intangible things that are hard to pinpoint but can still be used to determine a person is not one of us. The stigma of autism comes from all three sources and often involves oppressive coercion to conform. As one autistic woman puts it, as if I am only worthy if I behave in a certain way that neurotypicals find acceptable. We will look at the stigma of being different and not fitting in. We will see how certain core challenges we all experience can lead to stigma when our difficulties stand out more than normal. The book is written primarily from an autistic perspective, not only because of my own autisticity. Why can't he just write autism? Well, but because the history of autism is so intertwined with this complete form of oppression. Anyone whose life is touched by autism or who is interested in this form of personhood should appreciate the exploration this book undertakes. We can learn much about the mechanisms of stigma from autism and acquire helpful cautionary tales. Anyone whose life has been made difficult by the effects of chronic invalidation will better understand what they are dealing with. When past trauma is activated, the familiar routines of life may no longer work. Usual coping mechanisms may become ineffective. Anxiety can become intense. Yes, it may go through the roof. It may no longer be possible to take simple things for granted. The degree of trauma experienced after emotionally damaging events and the corresponding challenge of recovery is associated with many factors related to vulnerability and personal resilience. These factors may include formative experiences, exposure to multiple traumas, the safety of one's current environment, very important, sense of belonging, very important, physical and mental health, self-care strategies, also very important. For example, you have to know how to get in the flow state. What things give you a flow state, where you calm down, where you don't worry. Available supports, also very important. The strength of one's values and the flexibility to reassess them, ability to connect with emotional and spiritual intelligence, mindfulness, self-esteem, self-confidence, and many others. Trauma can also take many forms. It can also be associated with poverty, harassment, bullying, loss, and chronic invalidation. Trauma can be perpetuated by self-beratement and complicated when it involves repeated exposure over time, such as ongoing abuse, disregard, neglect, and being forced or choosing to endure a toxic or oppressive environment. The first thing here is you have to get out. You cannot heal if you are still in an abusive environment. You have to get out. Get away from this. Only then you can calm down. You can finally start to heal. Such trauma is often referred to as complex trauma. Judith Herman is often credited with first articulating this in her seminal book Trauma and Recovery. She specifically mentions prolonged terrors such as captivity, child abuse, and spousal abuse as sources of this kind of trauma and talks about a new diagnosis called complex PTSD. Oh man, I hope they will one day put that in the DSM. Still not in it. And then if you don't have a complex PTSD diagnosis, you don't get support. And especially autistics, because they are forced to actually adapt to an environment that is designed by neurotypicals, and because they have a fine-tuned nervous system, they have a tendency to be traumatized way quicker than neurotypicals. But this is still completely swept under the rug. Bessel van der Kolk, founder of one of the first trauma centers in North America, continues to work towards greater recognition of this form of socio-erosive trauma. his groundbreaking book, The Body Keeps the Score. You have to read that, it's really good. Is a comprehensive and engaging account of both the psychophysiological effects of relationship-based trauma and the growing body of eye-opening research on the impact of impoverished relationship. Writers such as Peter Levine distinguish between shock trauma, such as a car accident or assault, and developmental trauma involving disturbances of emotional attachment growing up, such as abuse, neglect, and failure to provide for social and emotional needs. Invalidation can be seen at the heart of such trauma. But here I must say there is also the whiplash accidents, and Dr. Robert Scare has written about this extensively because he has seen it and he has also worked with Peter Levine. And he says if there are whiplash accidents and the person develops this chronic pain, there is always a history of developmental trauma or even sexual abuse involved. And those patients, they often are not physically harmed very much. It even happened at a 10 mile per hour accident. So people think, why does this person have such issues? But there was always this kind of developmental trauma involved. And there is that last drop and your worry cup overflows, and that's that. Much of the emotional pain in such cases is related to assaults on a beleaguered self. In shock trauma, these assaults are primarily physical. Developmental trauma can involve physical assault, but often more damaging are perceived attacks on our personhood and the resulting invalidation. And Dr. Robert Scare always says, it's this combination of threat and feeling helpless in regards of this threat. And this causes stress, and PTSD is the result. These may be overt or subtle, and such invalidation does not necessarily involve blatant violence. There may be unaddressed patterns of behavior in which the child feels overwhelmed or uncomfortable with some aspect of a caregiver's manner towards them. A child's behavior may not be sufficient warning signal of potential problems. They may be well behaved and high achieving, but their efforts may be strategies of gaining acceptance or compensating to meet their unique needs. This core of invalidation often stays with a person right into adulthood and creates internalized shame-related problems. Autistic individuals often experience the chronic assault of invalidation trauma in the form of stigma, as do many others who don't fit dominant expectations of what people are supposed to be like. I have seen many clients experiencing long-term effects from such invalidation. This became trauma in the fiber of his being. This sentence always makes me cry. Oh, I can relate to that so much. It manifested itself in the form of dissociation. Yes, you just leave. the body, somehow. Mental absence or even physical absence. An inability to be present in the moment when stigma became activated. It's some kind of protection, so you don't have to feel that pain. Hypervigilance to rejection and high levels of physiological arousal triggered by perceived deficits of acceptance. It was feelings of isolation and abandonment during his long recovery. The quality of an individual's life can be significantly impacted by accumulated feelings of perceived exclusion, abandonment, and disrespect. When we experience repeated stigma, judgment, rejection, or prejudice because of qualities inherent to our personhood, qualities we may not be able to change or may not have chosen, we may end up experiencing identity fatigue, a form of complex trauma involving chronic assaults on the fullness of our humanity. More commonly, vulnerable individuals are excluded, degraded, denied access, and/or negatively labeled by otherwise well-meaning individuals who don't know how to interact with differently equipped others. Unfortunately, this often includes the unknowing actions of the very advocates and professionals who could be providing helpful support. Attitudes about autism have changed from a time when it was isolating and almost wholly misunderstood to today, when stars flock to a Broadway theater to talk about and raise millions for the cause. Stigma, however, continues to play a role in the experience of those whose lives are characterized by autisticity to any perceivable degree. This remains a grim social problem, causing unethical levels of avoidable pain. I was diagnosed with Asperger syndrome at the age of 44 and have dealt with the challenges of exclusion and judgment based on misunderstanding my whole life. My own autisticity exposes me to the confusion and rejection that can result when the often unconscious expectations of mainstream others are not fulfilled. This refers not only to specific social, communicative, and behavioral standards that are unnatural for autistic people to meet, but also to those awkward moments when social encounter breaks down and people get hurt and offended. Rather than turning away with uneasiness, we will try to learn from what happens when entrenched comfort levels are thrown off by individuals who do not conform to habitual formulas of what a person is supposed to be. Stigma is the real source of pain for autistic and autistic individuals, especially those of us whose autistic qualities are not pervasive, perhaps barely visible, and not associated with language difficulties, intellectual impairment, or painful physical challenges. This kind of autistic personhood is often called Asperger syndrome, although diagnostic restructuring in the DSM-5 homogenized autistic condition into a comprehensive condition called autism spectrum disorder. The term Asperger's no longer officially applies, which in my book was a mistake. This kind of autistic agency has also been referred to as high functioning. Yeah, and this is also not a good label, because high functioning simply means we are able to adapt better. It does not say that we don't struggle. But this term was never officially adopted, and many autistic individuals find it judgmental and demeaning. It is. Who's to say what it means to be high functioning? If this refers to conventional standards, hardly anything is conventional when it comes to autistic lives. No matter what it looks like to others who don't understand or appreciate our experience, we may be extremely high functioning given the challenges we are facing. It is best not to relegate others to a category of low functioning by creating a tier for the high functioning. Many people seem to believe autistic inner worlds are flat, desolate, and isolated by their very nature. Okay, very strange. The most important re-imaging here is to see that Ghost Town is not connected inherently to autistic existence, but emerges from the stigma and marginalizing society imposes on autistic difference. Douglas Bicklund was trying to get at this with the title of his pioneering study about the experience of autistic people who type to speak, autism and the myth of the person alone. The inner world of autistic people may be contoured differently and involve unconventional priorities, but qualitative studies tell us that autistic inner experience is lively and more complex than it may seem. Of course, we are sensory-based, right hemisphere experience. This is very different, very colorful. Autistic people have the same fundamental need for belonging and connection, yes, as socio-conventional people. It doesn't require a scientific study to reveal this. Simple curiosity and special efforts of compassionate communication allow us to see it for ourselves. The fear stigma creates can flatten curiosity, which might otherwise allow unique and different others to disavow us of the stereotypes and assumptions that get in the way of enriching human encounter. In my original research on stigma and autism at the University of Victoria, conducted in 2013 and involving in-depth interviews with 6 individuals diagnosed with Asperger's, participants gave poignant descriptions of bodily felt shame and rejection resulting from the stigma associated with their autistic personhood. Research indicates that autism has strong connection with PTSD in 2 important ways. There's an increased risk of social trauma from bullying, abuse, and alienation. Autistics are also at a higher risk of exposure to other adverse events like poverty, mental illness or social consequences from our parents' autism. Our neurological variations seem to be located in the same parts of the brain that PTSD injuries occur, specifically the autonomic nervous system, which controls our sensory processing, emotional regulation, and fight or flight responses, and in the prefrontal cortex, which helps with things like planning, decision-making, and social interactions. We have several overlapping characteristics with PTSD. Because the neurology is quite similar, this seems to make us more vulnerable to developing the stress disorder. This is why things like masking and fawning are very similar to each other. Rumination, sleep disturbances, anger, and avoidance are other common shared traits. So one autistic individual posted online that he was not able to quit drugs until after he was diagnosed, because the label deflected self-blame and gave him the confidence to try and confront life without numbing the pain artificially. Flustered and falling short. Goffman's insightful descriptions of experience are as powerful now as when they were written. His discussion of embarrassment and social flustering is not directed specifically towards high-functioning autism, because he does not consider autism in his writing. He does say an embarrassed person, after drawing attention to themselves with some kind of socially awkward behavior, will sense what sort of conduct ought to be maintained as the appropriate thing. Imagine how much worse the experience must be for someone who is foreign to socio-conventional behavior and has no sense of what is supposed to be appropriate. When we focus on qualities rather than openness to who a person is, basing our response to them on a combination of assumptions and unmet social expectations, the person picks up stigma telegraphically. This is true for anyone who does not conform with the sameness of dominant culture. The invalidation and shame of being humanly downgraded by encounter filtered through a reaction to attributes rather than openness to unique personhood is traumatizing, no matter what qualities such demeaning regard is based on. Looking with fresh eyes, the oppressive forces of social exclusion impact marginalized identities with a bewildering array of stigmatizing messages. Although Gabar-Mate 1999 argues that repeated humiliation, such as memories of having failed at many tasks, can only activate existing developmental trauma and not create its own shame, he may underestimate the full power of ongoing stigma and invalidation. I think of a young male client who had no stories of overt abuse, but could not make appropriate eye contact, always felt different from others, and eloquently described the pain of not being accepted by peers and family. Alcohol and Asperger syndrome, a dangerous combination or a successful coping strategy? For those who experience difficulty in interacting, socializing, or simply being in the presence of other people, the verbally, socially, and physically lubricating and loosening effects of alcohol can provide a gateway into an otherwise impenetrable and overwhelming arena where people mingle, make small talk, and get to know each other. Alcohol can maintain friendships, give access to a whole host of relationships, and even sustain career. Temple Grandin writes, "My biology was overreacting and treating something that should have been a minor annoyance as if a lion was stalking me. Like Matthew Tinsley, I could have easily fallen into the trap of becoming dependent on alcohol. At important work social events, I always used to have a few drinks because it calmed me down, to avoid having a problem. I never consumed alcohol in my house, but not everyone has the willpower to do this. Many people on the autism spectrum, in fact, go on to self-medicate with other kinds of drugs. During my teens and 20s, I had horrible, non-stop anxiety and panic attacks. Between the ages of 20 to 30, the panic episodes got worse. My nervous system was in a constant state of hypervigilance. My brain was acting as if I was in a jungle filled with dangerous predators that would eat me." Being well informed about the difficulties that people on the spectrum face is also very important. By spreading awareness of the potentially huge number of people on the spectrum who do in some way find themselves drinking to cope, Sarah Hendricks and Matthew Tinsley are doing the AS community a huge service and will hopefully help others to avoid the same problems. I had vaguely considered writing about my life whilst in rehab, but it was the jolt of meeting others with the condition, as well as seeing how useful many people had found the talks that Sarah and I gave, which was the real spur to putting together a book on the subject. I was very aware of how ideal was everyday life, using my self-knowledge as a coping tool instead of turning to alcohol and tranquilizers, as I had done so often in the past. If anything that I have gone through could be put to good use in order to help others in my situation, then I saw it as my duty to disseminate the information to as wide an audience as possible. I find that I am now leading a truly happy life, with no need for artificial calmatives, and am grateful for the opportunity I have been given to see life as it really is, and not through the distorted window that alcohol gave me. It is my hope and Sarah's that others in a similar predicament to me will find our experience and suggestion. Social support can make or break a person. If an autistic person is already feeling fragile and they reach out for help to a support person who doesn't understand autism, they can do much more harm than help. Thus, it depends on the type of social support being offered. There are family and friends, social workers, church groups, support groups, behavioral health people, therapists, and case managers. It also depends on how much social support is available and when. It's useful in finding a better way to live and to be. Letting them to do half the work. Exposure anxiety is nothing to be ashamed of. It may dictate a self in relation to self, indirectly confrontational orientation, which runs counter to the self in relation to other, directly confrontational social emotional orientation of most people, but being a minority doesn't mean you don't deserve understanding, equality, and real help. If that help isn't there, it's the unfortunate fact that the person with exposure anxiety is one of the pioneers who will help to build the understanding and help that they themselves and those like them need. Those who live with the condition themselves have often tried to teach the world around them how to help, not realizing that the world has never fully heard what the differences are. Without knowing this, behavioral, even typed or verbal cries for help are met with deaf ears, or a response that is worse than none at all. This is not a reason to give up asking the environment to do half the work. It seems, even in this day and age, people still struggle to really understand autism. And it appears to me that most, I'm not saying everybody, but most neurotypical people don't walk the extra mile to understand another way of thinking. There is always the expectation that the minority should adapt to the majority. But for some people, the culture where they feel at home is who they are. It's not what they chose. And they can't just switch off and change. High functional autistics may have figured out how to adapt to the neurotypical world, but it comes at a cost. And we should meet in the middle. Neurodiverse people should not be forced to come all the way to the left hemisphere thinking mainstream. We should meet on neutral territory in the middle. I think both cultures would profit. Right now, that's where we are, with neurotypicals thinking like that, all putting into tiny little boxes. If they walk the extra mile, they get over here and they can be part of this